Good evening, everyone. I'm Marie Dorigny, the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome to Reed Hall and to the SNF Rendez-Vous de l'Institut, the Fellows series. We're here tonight to hear David Scott talk about Stuart Hall and the Conjuncture of 1956, a crisis that led to the formation of the British New Left and the creation of what eventually became the New Left Review, one of the most important journals of the period. And David is currently writing a biography of Hall. David is the founder and editor of Small Axe Press and the Small Axe Project, which now includes not only essays, interviews, and scholarly articles on and from the Caribbean, but also fiction, poetry, music, and art reviews. The Ruth and William Lubick Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University, David is without a doubt one of the most respected public intellectuals on matters related to Caribbean history, post-colonialism, and questions of justice and reparations. His most recent book, Irreparable Evil, an essay in moral and reparatory history, which the wonderful bookstore, the Red Wheelbarrow, is selling here tonight, asks how we can rectify historical wrongs that are beyond repair. In a conversation on the Institute's library chat series, which you can watch on our website, unless I read this something else, David speaks about the importance of narrative mode as we conceive of the past in relation to the present, reflecting that perhaps tragedy is a more appropriate mode than the romance form that has traditionally shaped our accounts of history. Voice as a mode of thinking is tremendously important to David, as it was to his mentor and friend, Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall's voice was written by David as a series of letters addressed to Hall after his death, and he has spoken to us about this book and how it couldn't have existed in any other form. The form sort of imposed itself to him. One reviewer of this volume puts this quite beautifully by saying, "The book asks, what do we owe intellectually to the work of those whom we know well, admire, and honor? Reflecting one of the lessons of Hall's style, the book responds, what we owe should be conceived less in terms of criticism than in terms of listening." David has been listener extraordinaire at the Institute this year. His questions are sometimes so beautiful that it would be a shame to try to answer them. And his contributions to conversations with his fellow fellows has been nothing short of illuminating, to say nothing of his sincere and generous curiosity. This is the moment we've all been waiting for. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, David stops listening and does the talking.
Well, thank you very much for that, Marie. Thanks to Mark and Marie for the offer of the fellowship here at the Institute. Before coming to Paris, I'd been chair of my department for 6 long years. And the 8 months here, I think that's what it's been so far, have been a welcome way of liberating me from that particular burden. Thanks to Marie for curating such a marvelous space of conviviality and exchange. Thanks to Meredith and Sari for their warmth and fun and support. And thanks, of course, to all my fellow fellows for the sheer delight in being in conversation with you, in learning from you. A big thank you to you. And thanks to all of you who are here this evening, for what it's worth to listen to me. Okay, I have a limited ambition here. In the spirit of the presentations that have preceded mine, a spirit I take to have been one of both modesty and evasion, I'm not going to give you a full-on account of the life and work of Stuart Hall, not even a full-on account of the life and work of Stuart Hall in what I'm calling, using his expression, the conjuncture of 1956. I will come in a moment to this conjuncture and its importance, but I won't be going into deep detail about all the research I've allegedly been conducting in the archives in the Cadbury Research Library at the University of Birmingham, where most of Stuart Hall's papers are now kept, or in Stuart and Catherine's house in West Hampstead in London. There is simply too much that I have not yet digested, and so don't have a clear perspective on. So what I'm going to do instead is to offer you some provisional notes along the following lines. To begin with, I'm going to say something in general about what it is about Stuart Hall that seems to me to invite the idea of biography. Second, and in this context, I'm going to say something very briefly about what idea of writing a life, such as I can discern it, that informs what you might call my biographical intention. Third, I will give you a very provisional picture of Stuart from roughly the 1930s up to 1957. And then, not to be outdone by my colleagues, in addition to these images that I'm going to flip through, I have a bit of documentary footage of Stuart in the 1950s that I will share with you. And we will talk about them a little bit. When he died in 2014 at the age of 82, after a protracted illness, Stuart Hall was recognized globally as one of the towering intellectuals of the 20th century. He was one of the founders of the British New Left and one of the inventors of cultural studies. In the context of cultural studies, first formally at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham and subsequently at the Open University at Milton Keynes, Stuart made major contributions to a number of fields of inquiry, among them Marxism, media and communication studies, the study of popular culture, black studies, the study of identity, of Thatcherism, neoliberalism and globalization, and diaspora, and we could go on and on. There seems indeed scarcely a topic on the agenda of the late 20th century that Stuart didn't take up and transform in substantive ways. But as I have said now more times than I can count, but especially in my book, Stuart Hall's Voice, Intimations of an Ethics of Receptive Generosity, and in my essay, A Sense of Displacement, Stuart Hall's Art of Living, it is less the content of these intellectual contributions that has inspired and motivated my preoccupation with Stuart Hall than what I keep calling the content of the form of the intellectual life that has seemed to shape and animate these substantive interventions. In Stuart Hall's Voice, I tried to think about some of this in terms of Stuart's style, an idea I take to denote the soul of a form, not its decoration, not its embellishment, but its animating spirit, its vital force. I think that in some intellectuals and artists, more so than in others, style is especially pronounced, distinct, formative, more intrinsically indicative of the totality of the creative personality. And I used voice in its multidimensionality to evoke what I'm trying to get at. To me, voice embodied the soul of Stuart Hall's style. I mean that quite literally. The sound of the tone and timbre of his voice, which you will hear a little bit of in the clip I will play later. The slow, granular character of his spoken eloquence, the vocal intensity, jocularity, gravity, rhythms, fluidity, resonance. To hear Stuart speak was to be enveloped in a captivating oral environment. But I also mean voice in its extended metaphorical senses, the senses that evoke what was distinctive in Stuart's approach to thinking. Above all, his mode of thinking was dialogical. His teaching and his writing are characterized by the sense of him always thinking aloud with others. Thinking was not only a private matter, Hannah Arendt's 2-in-1 of the life of the mind, but also a matter of the agonistic concourse of deliberation in the company of others. The dialogical, moreover, formed a specifically ethical dimension of Stuart Hall's style, one in which listening to others was as important, indeed perhaps more important, than speaking to them. Stuart was not only a critical self, the practitioner of a hermeneutics of suspicion, he was also a listening self, attuned to a poetics of clarification. In a phrase I borrowed from the political theorist Roman Coles, I called this Stuart's ethics of receptive generosity. That is, an ethics of generosity attuned as much to receiving from others as giving to them. In a sense of displacement, an essay I refer to as a kind of prolegomenon to the biography I hope I'm writing, I tried to extend these reflections about the sort of intellectual Stuart was. Here I tried to formulate my inquiry by drawing on the classical idea of an art of living from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, a former slave from the margins of the Roman Empire, you will remember, and more recently elaborated variously by Pierre Hadot, Michel Foucault, and Alexander Nehamas. I use this idea to evoke Stuart's commitment to the practice of intellectual life less as an academic career than as a public vocation animated by the pursuit of the virtues of attunement, reflexiveness, and effectiveness. And what motivated this art of living, I suggested, was Stuart's chronic sense of displacement. By a sense of displacement, I mean a constitutive awareness of always being at odds with oneself and one's world, of never being able to quite correspond with a stable, authentic idea of one's identity, of always being, in the phrase he liked to borrow from Edward Said, out of place. Note then that it is less Stuart's theory of displacement that interests me than his embodied sense of it as a pre-critical disposition toward himself and his world. Displacement was his habitus. He knew it, as he liked to say, before he could spell it. It was not something he learned as much as something he learned to learn with. And part of what he learned to learn with it in the long detour of his art of living was how, in Nietzsche's paradoxical phrase, to become who he already was. In these texts, then, I think of myself as trying to approach Stuart Hall, of trying provisionally to find some language of description with which to conjure certain dimensions of his lived life onto the page of my written one. Which brings me to biography as a genre. I'm going to be briefer still. You have a sense, I hope, of what it is about Stuart Hall that prompts me in the direction of thinking about his life in relation to his work. But the idea of biography is not, to me, a self-evident one. For the moment, anyway, I'm going to take the biographer and Wittgensteinian philosopher, Ray Monk, as my guide. Monk, as you may know, is the author of 3 celebrated biographies on the philosophers Ludwig Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell, and the theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. But what is interesting to me is that Monk has urged a certain approach to writing biography that aims to evade both biography as theory and biography as fiction. I know that there's going to be a troublesome conversation tomorrow. Not surprisingly, Monk takes his bearings from Wittgenstein, and in particular, Wittgenstein's view that understanding is not a matter of theory, but of discerning connections. What especially motivates Monk are his doubts about what he calls the theoretical turn in thinking about biography. This turn owes its origins, he says, to the dissatisfaction with the way that biography was practiced in the Victorian age, that is, the production of uncritical, fact-filled, typically two-volumed works. These, of course, had been attacked by Bloomsbury modernists, especially Lytton Strachey and Virginia Woolf. What was required, Strachey maintained in his famous preface to Eminent Victorians, was to turn the undigested mass of facts about singular individuals into something that enabled us to understand them, that is, to have a point of view of them, a way of arranging the facts about them into a coherent, meaningful portrait. This was an important argument, but what is a point of view? The theoretical turn, Monk thinks, has been a series of misunderstandings of the idea of a point of view. His examples are Freud and Sartre. For them, a point of view is a theory, that is, systemic propositions about the self that the biographical narrative is mobilized to confirm. Freud's famous little book on Leonardo da Vinci and Sartre's biographies of Baudelaire, Flaubert, and Genet, Monk sees as attempts to use a life to illustrate a theory of subjectivity. In this sense, Monk argues, these biographies are really more about Freud and Sartre than they are about the subjects of their work. On the other hand, for some, a point of view is a fiction-making process. Uh-oh. The beginnings of this direction are, of course, Virginia Woolf, both in her famous essays, The Art of the New Biography and The Art of Biography, as well as in what Monk calls her spoof on biography, Orlando. But on Monk's view, despite Woolf's seeming alignment with Strachey, her motivation was really to overturn biography in favor of fiction. Only fiction, Woolf seems to suggest, can capture the inner essence of a life. Needless to say, Monk argues that a more satisfying direction is to be found by evading both theory and fiction. It is one informed by Wittgenstein's idea of, quote, the kind of understanding that consists in seeing connections, unquote. Such an understanding from seeing connections, he thinks, is generated through perspicuous representations that enable us to discern and track family resemblances among various moments, people, events, actions, and so on. Unlike with theory, the aim is not propositional truth about something more like, but something more like perspicacity, discernment, penetration. The aim is to get us to see our subject differently. Monk is not saying that all points of view are equal, but their differences should be measured by their coherence, by their clarity, by their insightfulness, not by a claim to truth, whether of theory or of fiction. Monk's description of biography as a mode of non-theoretical, non-fictional description of a life that aims nevertheless at imaginatively illuminating, establishing, and clarifying some at least of the connections that make up that lived life is one that I find attractive because it resonates with what I have been trying to say about Stuart in Stuart Hall's voice and a sense of displacement. Indeed, I want to think of displacement as one way of framing a point of view on Stuart, a way of organizing a narrative picture of the generative movement and interconnectedness of his life and work. The title of my lecture is Stuart Hall and the Conjuncture of 1956. This is, of course, to gesture at the famous story of the role of Stuart Hall in the making of the British New Left. For Stuart, 1956 was not simply a calendar year. It was, he always said, a conjuncture. That is, a temporal rupture that did not simply divide the past from the present, but that altered and reorganized the cognitive political ground or problem space of thinking and acting. Stuart largely meant this in terms of the making of the New Left, but he also recognized that the conditions of the formation of the New Left were simultaneously the conditions of transformation of his own cultural political orientation, and perhaps also his own personal horizons as an intellectual. The conjuncture of 1956, then, is crucial to the overall story of Stuart Hall's life and work because it forms a sort of hinge, a word Stuart himself uses, that both connects and separates his formative years as a colonial subject in Jamaica in the 1930s and 1940s, and the first emergence of the political intellectual Stuart Hall in the middle to late 1950s. How to render that hinge intelligible has been a large part of what I've been doing here at the Institute. Stuart MacPhail Hall was born in Kingston, Jamaica on 3 February 1932. The youngest of Jesse and Herman Hall's 3 children, George and Patricia, were his siblings. In the finely grained color class parlance of Jamaican historical sociology, they were a brown middle-class family, which is to say, they were neither black nor white nor poor, neither fish nor fowl nor good red herring, as we were taught to say. Indeed, as we will see in a moment, this negative mode of identification constituted the very essence of their fragile class identity. In any case, the Hall family were comfortable without being affluent. They had standing and respectability without wealth. Herman Hall was an accountant and rose to become the first chief accountant for the Jamaican branch office of the United Fruit Company, the US multinational corporation that monopolized the trade in fruit in Central America and the Caribbean in the early 20th century. The Halls lived in well-appointed middle-class comfort in the salubrious atmosphere of Trevanion Park Road, then a leafy suburb of the Kingston and St. Andrew metropolitan area. So I'm going to use a clicker. We will come back to this beautiful photograph, but here is the Hall family, round about the 1965. I don't have an image of them in the 1950s. That's Stuart in the back. That's Herman Hall on the left here, and Stuart's mother, Jessie, on Stuart's left or right, and that's Catherine Hall, to whom Stuart has just married.
It's the mic on your back.
Oh, but you get the point. Now, the historical sociology or the historical social psychology of the Jamaican brown middle class is a complex story to tell. I have suggested elsewhere that it is in this familial context that in a pre-theoretical way, Stuart comes to embody displacement as a primary form of experience, that displacement comes to acquire that quality of second nature that informed his structure of dispositions and that would constitute the implicit background resource for his later more self-consciously reflective or theoretical ideas, such as diaspora. How so? Speaking in an excessively shorthand and perhaps even perversely reductive way, it is important to bear in mind that the Jamaican brown middle class was historically born within and out of the social contradictions and sexual violations and depredations of colonial plantation slavery. In a certain very relevant sense, the Jamaican brown middle class was born already out of place, anomalous, an excrescence within a social economic order principally organized around a black, white, enslaved, free racial binary. In this racial dynamic, the free-coloreds, ancestors of the brown middle class, belonged to neither one pole nor the other, neither fish nor fowl. They lived rather in a structurally indissoluble ambivalence. In one direction, in disavowal of any proximity with blackness, including the blackness within themselves. In another direction, in aspiration of material and symbolic identification with whiteness. In a profound social, cultural, and psychological sense, neither this disavowal nor this aspiration were completely realized, completely realizable. And therefore, what defines the brown middle class is the way it has lived perpetually, unevenly, in an unresolvable tension of anxiety, in an anxiety of belonging. In May and June 1938, when Stuart was 6 years old, the black working poor on rural sugar estates and the Kingston docks, frustrated by the refusal of the economic powers to meet their demands for better pay and improved working conditions, unleashed a fury of violence that startled the colonial state and drove the privileged behind locked doors. This was, remember, 1938, exactly 100 years after slave emancipation. The angry men and women in the streets were, in effect, scarcely more than the third generation of freed people. Materially speaking, very little had changed in their lives since the bondage of their foreparents. Even less had changed in the non-material dimensions. Racial subordination and the attendant racial humiliation were still defining features of the unremittingly hard lives of the black poor. Of the labor revolt of 1938, Stuart always said to me that he had no memory. He was 6, remember? Of the actual unfolding events. What he would always remember, however, and vividly, was the atmosphere of apprehension in his household, the amorphous fear of the black mob surging into their middle-class neighborhood, breaking into their homes and murdering them in their beds. This is the intimate racial terror of a social class or social fragment whose fundamental ambition was to escape from or to protect themselves against the degrading stain of blackness. It was these events of May-June 1938 that triggered the acceleration of the nationalist project of constitutional decolonization in Jamaica, with the founding in September that year of the People's National Party. For the first decade of its existence, this movement would be significantly shaped by the left wing of the party that included a small but influential Marxist contingent. Thus, the late 1930s and 1940s, this is the period of Stuart's early growing up, were a period of intense anti-colonial expectation, not least for the brown middle class, which to a substantial degree defined the orientation of anti-colonial nationalism. Not so for Stuart's parents, Jessie and Herman, part of a small class fraction who looked toward the future of a sovereign Jamaica with a good deal of fretful agitation. Attuned as he was to his parents' racial ambivalence, Stuart would have sensed this. The first adult suffrage elections in Jamaica that brought the mass of black working people into the formal field of politics were held in December 1944, the same year Stuart begins secondary school. It must have been a relief to his parents that the Nationalist Party lost to its rival, the Jamaica Labour Party, a right-of-centre populist party led by a near-white demagogue. But looking back, Stuart would recognize himself as a child of this conjuncture of 1938 that defined both the colonial location of his subjectivity and his incipient anti-colonial antagonism toward it. Stuart would be fascinated by the way in which a family, his family, could be a living microcosm of the colonial racial order, how the outside is lived on the inside, how the external structures are translated into the intimate psychic dramas of a household. Stuart was the darkest of the members of his family in a society in which skin shade, hair texture, and the shape and size of the nose and lips mattered to one's position in the ranked order of color. In Jamaica, everyone has an instinctive knowledge of the position of others on the basis of the most cursory reading of minute phenotypical features. Stuart's sister, Patricia. It's Patricia on the right, Stuart on the left, who I met a number of years ago in the woman's club home in Kingston, not long before she died in 2016, was, to my eye, very light-skinned, almost white. When Stuart was in high school, Patricia fell in love with a young medical student from another Caribbean island studying at the University College of the West Indies. He was from a respectable family, but he was black, unmistakably, one might say, black. Patricia's parents, her mother in particular, demanded an end to the relationship. Shortly after, Patricia suffered a nervous breakdown. Stuart was outraged, but also perplexed at the psychodynamics of how traumatizing power is lived contradictorily along the contours of complicity. For what inflamed his confusion, he would say, was Patricia's submission to her mother's insistence that she be treated psychiatrically for her condition. She received shock treatment. She was never the same again. Stuart attended high school at Jamaica College on Old Hope Road between 1944 and 1950, an old and venerable school. I might say it was my high school too. An old and venerable school, indeed one of the oldest continuously running schools in Jamaica. It traces its beginnings to the late 18th century founding of Drake's free school. Free meaning not for the enslaved, not free in terms of tuition. Through a provision made by Charles Drax, a wealthy slave owner. In the middle 20th century, Jamaica College was a grammar school on the English model for middle and upper middle class boys, browns, whites, some blacks, who showed academic promise. They were often taught by expatriate teachers from Oxford and Cambridge. The school had a reputation for discipline. Caning was not infrequent. I was caned very, very often. But also for intellectual rigor and seriousness. Long before Stuart meets English studies at Oxford, he is aware of the role of literature in cultivating the finer sensibilities. It was the sort of school where an adolescent schoolboy like Stuart would read Matthew Arnold, but also read Marx and Freud. That's Stuart with his tennis racket. He was practicing at his school, Jamaica College. There's a very interesting story about his parents. His parents had a tennis court on the lawn of their Trevanion Park Road house, where Stuart was apparently not allowed to play. At Jamaica College, Stuart began to fashion himself as something of a writer. In 1948, when he was 16 years old, he was the editor of the school yearbook, writing its editorial, a page and a half of serious prose, and contributing a poem, Our World. It is a curious poem, eight stanzas long, evoking the hard-edged atmosphere of factory work. I'll just read the first of the stanzas. Our world, a world of factories, peaks of giant towers that reach upwards with grasping fingers for the stars. It is not clear what the sources are for these proletarian images, but this is also the period in which Stuart discovered modernism, at no less a place than the library of the Institute of Jamaica in downtown Kingston. Solemn and quiet with long, highly polished tables, this colonial institution, founded in 1879, is not where you would imagine anyone encountering modernism. Quote, I well remember, Stuart says, as an aspiring young poet in the romantic mode, my first encounter with the recognizably contemporary vernacular, conversational language and rhythms of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Magic, unquote. And he goes on a bit later, and I quote again. Why did Eliot's crowd seem so depressed? Why was the poem so broken up, so disjointed, so fragmented? Why had Eliot allowed Ezra Pound to re-edit it so extensively? Above all, what had any of it to do with Jamaica and with my life? Unquote. Stuart won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University in 1950. Stuart here at the Governor General's, the Governor's residence in 1950 at the ceremony for the Rhodes Scholars of that year. He taught for a while at Knox College, where his girlfriend Mavis Burke was also teaching. And in the summer of 1951, accompanied by his mother Jessie, he set sail from Port Antonio to the UK to take up his Rhodes at Oxford. That's his mother Jessie on the right. That's Stuart on our left. They didn't know this at the time, but they were sailing into a very brutal hurricane, Hurricane Charlie of 1951. Stuart arrived in a mid-century Britain that was in the middle of a complex set of changes in a society significantly battered by the war. Signs of the damage wrought by the German bombing campaign were still visible in the shabby disrepair of post-war London. There were also less visible signs of a society under stress. Rationing continued into the early 1950s. But enlivening austerity London, the Festival of Britain had opened on the South Bank in May 1951. Not surprisingly, it was on the list of places Stuart and his mother visited in the couple of weeks they spent in London as tourists. Conceived by Herbert Morrison ostensibly to mark the centennial of the Great Exhibition of 1851, its real purpose was to put on display the not insignificant achievements of the Labour administration of Clement Attlee. After all, since coming to power in 1945, Attlee had spearheaded the remaking of Britain as a welfare state. But in 1951, not only had the Conservative Party in the meantime reorganized itself, but Labour was rapidly losing support among the middle classes especially. Moreover, by forcing Britain to rearm, the Korean War had put a huge damper on the much vaunted post-war economic recovery. More than anything else, the aim of the Festival of Britain was to celebrate the idea of Britain, an idea tarnished not simply by war, but by the humiliation of having to depend on a special relationship with its former colony, the United States, the new undisputed world power. For the war had, to put it crudely, destroyed not simply the veneer, but also the substantive structures that had made Britain the world power since the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Even as the festival gave off an air of self-congratulation, Attlee's administration was limping toward the November national elections in which it was defeated, making way for Winston Churchill's triumphant return to number 10 Downing Street. From end to end, from Churchill to Macmillan, the 1950s would be a conservative decade, a decade of increasing mobility and affluence for the middle classes. By mid-decade, it would also be an age of youth and an age of apathy and anger for wide swathes of absolute beginners, as Colin McGuinness was to later call them, who grew to adulthood after the war and whose frustrations would be embodied in John Osborne's famous play of 1956, Look Back in Anger. Of course, of more immediate significance, though not unrelated to the perilous economic state of post-war Britain, was that the London to which Stuart and his mother arrived was one already being considerably unsettled by the arrival of immigrants, West Indian immigrants, more precisely. On 13 April 1948, an advertisement appeared in the old Jamaican daily, the Daily Gleaner, announcing the opportunity to sail to Britain from Jamaica on the HMT Empire Windrush. The Empire Windrush was formerly a German passenger liner, subsequently a Nazi troopship used for the invasion of Norway and the transshipment of Norwegian Jews. It had been taken over by Britain as a prize of war. The price of the ticket was £28 10 shillings. The Empire Windrush set sail from Kingston on 24 May 1948, making its way up the Thames to the Tilbury docks in Essex on the morning of 22 June 1948, with a complement of 1,027 ticketed passengers, a large number of them Jamaicans, and several stowaways. They were exercising their right as subjects of the British Empire to live and work in Britain. In the following years, to the confused ambivalence of the Labour government, boatload after boatload of immigrants arrived. It was the effective beginning of the end of an old idea of England. For Stuart, this was a moment of sharply delineated ambiguity, ironic bafflement. His mother and himself had taken lodgings at the Methodist International House in Bayswater, a former hotel that opened in 1950 as a residence for overseas students. Here, Stuart met not only other Caribbean students, but had his first encounter with students from other parts of the empire. This experience alone was significant because, as he put it later, it helped him to acclimatize slowly to London in a place which was not impenetrably English. But the penetrability of Britain to its others would soon be brought home to him in another unexpected way within days of his arrival. In what can only be described as an uncanny encounter with the displaced paradoxes of his own identity, one to which he would return again and again in later life, Stuart describes an almost primal scene of dislocation as he watched streams of black Caribbean people just off the boat trains pouring out of Paddington Station. And he writes, I quote, "The sight of all those black people in the center of London was astonishing. What I thought I had left behind as an unresolved dilemma, the difficulties my family background had bequeathed to me of neither wanting any identification with my own social stratum nor being able to feel present in my own homeland, conscious of the chasm that separated me from the multitude, had turned up to meet me on the other side of the Atlantic. This made me feel like I was traveling forward toward the past, unquote. This was the advance guard, of course, of the Windrush generation. It was an episode of what the great Jamaican poet, Louise Bennett, Miss Lou, would sardonically call colonization in reverse. And though he could not yet give it a name, it was, Stuart says, a game-changing moment for him. After a few weeks in London, Stuart and his mother went up to Oxford. He was registered at Merton College. Founded in 1264, Merton is one of the oldest constituent colleges in that ancient university. Given his revelatory encounter with the wasteland in Kingston, it couldn't have been unimportant to Stuart that T.S. Eliot had been at Merton before him. Stuart was enrolled to read English. The School of English Language and Literature at Oxford was established in 1894. In the 1950s, J.J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were its luminaries. Thank you, Hannah. Is Hannah here? Hannah? But the real revolution in English studies in Britain had taken place at Cambridge, where in the 1920s and 1930s, a school of practical criticism had emerged, initiated by I.A. Richards, but most prominently sustained by F.R. Leavis. Leavis was influenced by Richards's idea of the critic's unwavering attention to the literary text, these words in this order. But he was also focused on the relation between the text and the world, arguing that the literary criticism of literature was inseparable from the moral criticism of life. Above all, Leavis sought to emphasize the seriousness and gravity of the best literature. The rigorous intellectual task of the literary critic was to excavate the moral depth of literary work and to connect it to the moral character of the world around them. This is Stuart when he's just arrived, and that's his mother. Merton behind them. Stuart completed his BA Honours in English Language and Literature in 1954 on his Rhodes Scholarship. He would receive his MA in 1957. In 1954, he was awarded a Jamaica Scholarship, which enabled him to begin research for his DPhil. His subject was the fiction of Henry James. Europe versus America, social and moral themes in the fiction of Henry James was its formal, somewhat prosaic title. It is not clear when he decided that James would be his subject. This thesis would never be completed. But why Henry James? It is not easy to say. Stuart liked to joke that at least Henry James was dead, which was the first criterion of his supervisor. But more importantly, as the tentative title of the dissertation indicates, James was an American in Europe and a poignant observer of the contrasts between Europeans and Americans. And this was a period of the beginnings through the Marshall Plan of the Americanization of Britain and, alas, of Europe. Almost without giving it a name, Stuart was thinking through displacement. Henry James was diasporic. But as importantly, perhaps, Stuart had it on unimpeachable authority that Henry James was one of the greatest writers in the English tradition. James, remember, was one of the four writers, the others being George Eliot, Joseph Conrad, and Jane Austen, that F.R. Leavis had designated the great English novelists, and about whom he had written in his well-known book of 1950, The Great Tradition. In his early years in Oxford, Stuart moved very much in a West Indian milieu centered on the Oxford West Indian Society. Of fundamental importance to him during these years was the emergence of a distinctive and remarkable body of West Indian literature. Between the late 1940s and the late 1950s, a significant number of West Indian writers, most of them based in London, had their work published and reviewed in Britain. Among them, V.S. Reid, Andrew Salkey, Edgar Mittelholzer, Samuel Selvon, George Lamming, Roger Mays, V.S. Naipaul, Jan Carew, John Hearn, all men and mainly novelists, or in some cases, like George Lamming, poets who became novelists. They were, so to speak, the literary wing of the Windrush generation. One of the infrastructural contexts for the reception and circulation of their work in Britain was the Caribbean Voices program at the BBC, initiated in 1943 by the Jamaican poet and journalist Una Marson, in whose sister's primary school Stuart had been a student. But at the time, and until it closed in 1958, under the editorship of Henry Swansea. Not surprisingly, Stuart moved in the company of these writers, spiritually and physically. They all passed through the West Indian Student Centre in Earl's Court. Stuart, too, was an aspiring writer of poetry and short fiction as well. But he was also a keen student of criticism in the mode of Leavis and Leavis's famous journal, Scrutiny. In the early 1950s, Stuart wrote an essay called West Indian Talent and the Traditions. It was never published. The allusion in the title, of course, is to one of the defining essays of modernist criticism, T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, first published in the major modernist review, The Egoist, in 1919. For West Indian writers of Stuart's generation, the distinction between the durable inheritance of literary tradition on the one hand and the superficiality or variability of mere talent on the other was an inescapable and haunting one. Given the ruptures that constitute West Indian slave colonial history, where could an assimilable tradition come from? What should be the evaluative measure of talent? Some of the themes in this early essay work their way into another essay of Stuart's, entitled Lamming, Selvon, and Some Trends in the West Indian Novel. This one published in 1955, notably in BIM, then the premier literary magazine of the Anglophone Caribbean, founded by Frank Collymore in 1942. BIM, from Bimshire, a term of endearment. Is that Keithley?
Yep, that's right.
You will know this. A term of endearment for Barbados was, in a sense, a West Indian scrutiny. That is, an attempt to curate a space, not simply for literary publication, but for a concerted literary response to the cultural political changes in the post-war Caribbean. Stuart's essay is a model of Leavisite criticism. I wish I could discuss it at length here, but I can't. I'll just discuss the first paragraph. The essay opens with a paragraph-long meditation on the relation between the novel form and social experience. One of the characteristic tasks of the novel form, he says, is to, and the novelists among you will respond to this, I'm sure, of the novel form, he says, is to explore the, quote, dramatic situations of a changing and dynamic culture, unquote. Here is the classic Leavis idea of the organic connection between literature and its environment. A West Indian education, Stuart laments, presumably reflecting on his own, has typically sought to seal art off from the world in which it is embedded, so that art appears disconnected from experience. But the truth is, Stuart says, with just a hint of Oxford authority, that, quote, the novel, compared with either poetry or drama, owes its vigor today to the fact that it is the only art form which is able to draw within its confines the thick substance of life itself. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? The thick substance of life itself, unquote. And the task of the critical intelligence, he continued, and I quote again, is to discover how, as life moves from experience to art, it is made significant and evaluated by the artist. unquote. Literature, he announces, and I quote again, necessarily involves evaluation. In the novel, we confront our behavior with our sense of values as we confront the chaos of experience with the pattern of an art form. It is to live more fully. This is for Juan. It is to live more fully that we read more fully, not vice versa. Literature is nothing that is to say that can engage us deeply as general readers, unless it is a way of bringing the deepest concerns of any society to a pitch of greater and greater significance, unquote. It's beautiful. It is in these terms, those of dramatization and evaluation, that Stuart then turns to the very recent rise of the novel form in West Indian literature, its challenges and functions, and urges that the novel, quote, must give us an eye with which we see our society and an eye with which we measure ourselves in our search for identity, unquote. Significantly, in the same issue of BIM, there are also two poems by Stuart. London, Impasse by Vauxhall Bridge. I don't know if any of you guys know Oxford Bridge is from South Bank to Pimlico. And Impasse, Cities to Music, perhaps. They are both essentially elegiac poems of London, impressionistic evocations of dimensions of the city's bewitching landscape, its river, its atmosphere, its bridges, its cadences, its light, its fuss and fume, by a young colonial finding his way, lost, perhaps sometimes literally, uncertain of which direction will bear his future. And here is a passage from London, Impasse by Vauxhall Bridge. The spirit, too late and cannot, hear ships' distant cornets haunt, eaves and echoes of a rented mind, unquote. It's fascinating, the contrast between the critical voice and the poetic voice, the former definitive in its orientation to the idea of literature, the latter poignant and hesitant and resonant with the unavoidable impasses and conflicts of his own self-making. Still, this is Stuart Hall at 23 years old in 1955, moving in the imaginary of a West Indian milieu in Britain, deeply embedded in the exploration and interpretation of the West Indian literary experience, and profoundly perceptive of the West Indian literary response to the changing landscape of West Indian cultural history. By the middle 1950s, however, Stuart's explicit intellectual attention appears to have started to turn more towards British politics, or anyway toward an attempt to grasp the cultural political life more immediately around him. True, the Caribbean does not simply disappear. The relation is never severed. But the Caribbean is, in some sense, dislodged in his preoccupations. There are at least two interconnected Oxford seminar contexts that offer important resources for thinking about this turn in Stuart's orientation. One was the seminar of the socialist political theorist G.D.H. Cole, and the other was the seminar of the literary critic and editor F.W. Freddie Bateson. G.D.H. Cole was an English socialist of very complex pedigree whose contribution to the British labour movement and the traditions of independent British socialism from the 1920s onwards is very large indeed. When Stuart met him, he was the Churchill Professor of Social and Political Thought at Oxford. More importantly, he was the focal point of a regular seminar gathering in All Souls College known as the Cole Group that brought together a diverse array of the Oxford student left. not only independent socialists like Stuart, but communists like Raphael Samuel and Gabriel Pearson and Peter Sedgwick. In the 1950s, Cole was in the middle of his last campaign to build an international socialist project. He conceived the idea of an international society for socialist studies that was launched here in Paris in March 1956 in a conference aimed to bring together socialists from across the world. His French collaborator was Claude Bourdet, about whom some of you will know. Stuart, then also a participant in the Oxford Socialist and Labour Clubs, was a part of this inaugural Paris meeting, and he became its effective representative in Oxford. The organization lasted no more than a year. Freddie Bateson was a wide-ranging literary scholar steeped not only in the classical, late medieval and Renaissance traditions, but in the modern English traditions as well. Stuart was a student in Bateson's seminar and later spoke of them as being profoundly inspiring for the solemnity and gravity they brought to thinking about the larger role of literature in society. As important as these seminars, however, Bateson was also the founder in 1951 of the journal Essays in Criticism that is still published today, obviously inspired by Matthew Arnold's 1865 book of the same title. It may not be surprising that one of the participants in Bateson's project was the young Raymond Williams, who often visited Oxford. Williams was attracted to Bateson and contributed to the journal. Indeed, it was in Essays in Criticism that in 1953, Williams published an essay called The Idea of Culture, a preliminary foray into what eventually became his classic 1958 book, Culture and Society. And it was in Freddie Bateson's seminar that Stuart met Raymond Williams, somewhere around 1954, 1955. It would be hard to overstate just how momentous an encounter this was for Stuart. They would develop a fast and long-lasting comradeship. Williams was, as Stuart would say in his 1988 obituary, the most important intellectual influence on him. It is not hard to see why. Williams, 11 years Stuart's senior, was 33 years old at the time. He must have seemed to Stuart an enormously attractive figure, forbidding in the range and depth of his literary and political knowledge, driven in his socialist convictions, independent in his interventions, but at the same time unpretentious in manner and mode and comportment. Decidedly not an Oxford type, not even English. In fact, someone from a virtual colony of England, Wales. But more importantly, here was someone coming not from the normative centre, working with a notion of culture as part of a left critique. It makes sense that an idea of culture would appeal to a young colonial from Jamaica as culturally elsewhere as Wales. The import of both seminar contexts would converge in the summer of 1956. That summer, Stuart and his friend, Alan Hall, no relation, persuaded Williams to let them have a few chapters of the Culture and Society manuscript to take away with them on vacation in Cornwall as part of their reading material to help them, as Stuart put it later, quote, to sketch out a book on the new contours of cultural change in contemporary capitalism, unquote. I wish I could discuss this manuscript. It's a quite intriguing manuscript. But no sooner had Alan and Stuart returned from their Cornish holiday with the 84-page manuscript than two major upheavals in autumn 1956 from different political directions threw everything into a state of turmoil. After a protracted standoff between the leadership of the Hungarian uprising and Nikita Khrushchev on 4 November 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and within days brutally crushed the short-lived Hungarian experiment. The Soviet invasion of Hungary sent an unmistakable message that whatever Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February that year might have meant in the context of internal post-Stalin politics, it would not mean a real democratic opening for dissident oppositional politics within the Soviet sphere of influence. On 5 November 1956, after months of conspiratorial meetings, some of them here in Paris, and following an initial incursion by Israeli forces in late October, Britain and France launched a full-scale invasion of the Suez Canal Zone, aiming to depose Abdel Nasser in order to reverse his sovereign claim to this strategic part of Egyptian territory. The invasion of Suez was, in the end, as you know, a failure and a humiliating diplomatic disaster for France, but especially for Britain's Anthony Eden, since the US President Dwight Eisenhower demanded on pain of severe economic sanctions the immediate withdrawal of their respective troops. But it vividly demonstrated the fragility of decolonization and the crude will to imperial power that could be mobilized to maintain the international status quo. These two events, Stuart later said, and I quote, whose dramatic impact was heightened by the fact that they occurred within days of each other, unmasked the underlying violence and aggression latent in the two systems that dominated political life at the time, Western imperialism and Stalinism, and sent a shockwave through the political world. In a deeper sense, they defined for people of my generation the boundaries and limits of the tolerable in politics, unquote. And it is these two events that form the constitutive moments of the conjuncture of 1956. Together they precipitated an opening in which the first New Left emerged in 1957 in the form of two distinct intellectual political journal platforms, The New Reasoner, edited by John Saville and Edward Thompson, and Universities and Left Review, edited by Stuart Hall, Raphael Samuel, Gabriel Pearson, and Charles Taylor. These formations, as Stuart said of them, emerged independently of each other out of contrasting political traditions and intellectual generations. From their different directions, however, both journal projects were in search of a path of left intervention outside of the existing alternatives, that of Stalinism, of this Communist Party of Great Britain on the one hand, and the Labour Party with its social democracy on the other. At the beginning of 1960, these two journals would merge to form the first New Left Review, with Stuart as its inaugural editor. I'm going to leave this much foreshortened story here, but I want to ask, who has Stuart Hall become by the middle to late 1950s? Beyond the voice of the publications that are beginning to emerge, how can we discern a picture of him, his personality, at that age, at the age of 25, a doctoral candidate in English, an aspiring poet and fiction writer, and co-editor of a new review of considerable promise? What distance has he traveled from that expectant young man looking into the camera as he sets off from Jamaica with his mother just a few years before, in 1951? The May 15, 1957 issue of the Oxford University student magazine, ISIS, an old and revered platform for provocative discussion, it was established in 1892, carried a one-page profile of Stuart Hall. ISIS was at the time edited by Dennis Potter, who becomes very famous in broadcasting in Britain later on. Notably, the profile is accompanied by a photograph of Stuart's sitting over an unfinished plate of food in Stuart's Richmond Road digs. One friend or colleague on either side of him, and Stuart and one of these friends looking up toward a fourth person outside of the frame of the picture, no doubt the ISIS biographer, as he called himself. The photograph captures a now familiar image of the young Stuart Hall, attractive with his neatly trimmed moustache and goatee, the captivating, genial smile that suggests an open, relaxed, obliging nature, a willingness to be engaged. The profile offers in quick strokes some basic background information, but much of the description is moving toward some prescient observations about Stuart's personality. The ISIS biographer writes, and I quote, "One gets the feeling from him that there is a great deal inside to be exploited, and he has a loose but powerful and dramatic style, whose only weakness is an occasional tendency to use two resounding words where one simple one would do as well," unquote. As elsewhere, the profiler has put their finger on something here, not only the sense of Stuart's style as a speaker and writer, but also the sense of him charged with inspiration and potential, not yet entirely articulated, but palpably, vibrantly there nevertheless. The profile closes with this fascinating portrait of Stuart, and I quote again, "All this has given a laughably incomplete picture. One will remember Stuart presiding over his meals or meetings with a slightly withdrawn air. Presiding could nearly be one of his natural functions. He is a pretty good pianist with Brubeck Mulligan leanings, kind but quite incidentally, so that you just have to take it for granted, capable of enlivening you, being angry with you, and disappearing into an almost frightening resignation from which you wonder how he will ever return. One would classify him zoologically as a panther, but one whose claws are normally retracted. When they come out, beware." And most of the time when they are in, one has a sense that he is holding something back, something far down that he does not want to give away. Precisely what this is not within the scope of the present exegesis to determine, unquote. And I'll stop there. Thank you guys very much. That's it.
I'm trying to articulate. This was wonderful, by the way. Thank you very much for sharing some of the work. I mean, we get a sense of where you're going. And I suppose my question is, we're in a period right now where biographies are being put out, thinking about this tradition about a number of great Black thinkers, right? I have in mind Alan Locke's recent biography by, I think, Jeffrey Stewart, where his goal was to do an incredibly exhaustive examination of Locke's life. I mean, to the point where it's a monumental 900-page thing.
Fine print.
Yes. And then I think of the Williams biography of C.L.R. James that goes in a different direction, not necessarily going into minutiae, but giving us a sense of, well, he uses cricket as a sort of motif throughout, right? And it seems to me that you're somewhere in the middle of these two. Is that an intuition, or?
I think that's a good observation. There is a sense in which I'm not sure where I am. But it is true that I had initially imagined an exhaustive biography, Monday through Friday kind of biography, what happens. Not quite, but also the kind of meticulously scholarly biography. I'm shifting gears, I think, somewhat. This is partly why I wanted to think out loud with Ray Monk's idea of trying to paint a picture trying to paint a portrait in which you grapple with a way of understanding a life than simply filling volumes of the facts of a life. So I'm leaning there, but there is something about the distinctiveness of the life, which is partly why I paint that picture of the kind of middle-class background that Stuart emerges out of. That is, I think, enormously important to say in significant social and historical detail what the implications were of being shaped by that kind of context. So I don't know whether I'll be able, and I am Marie has promised me a second year of the fellowship.
Oh,
and so I'm hoping that by the end of next year I'll be further along. That is exactly what I'm struggling with.
Okay. Yeah. Well, but you opened the door to the fact that there is this potential for fiction, and I must admit I didn't realize early Stuart Hall's not even necessarily obsession, but playing around with the value of fiction at that point, so that to tell the story of his life, I mean, requires a certain amount of imagining within the facts of the life.
Well, I mean, this is a quarrel that will go on tomorrow, I'm sure. But yes and no. I mean, it is fascinating to think about Stuart between 1948 and well into 1960, because one of his stories is published in a volume edited by Andrew Southey, one of the short stories, in 1960. So it takes a while for him to abandon the idea that Larry, bless you, to give up the idea that the literary craft is what he should devote himself to. But it is. So I am thinking about the way in which a literary imagination, Stuart's literary imagination, shapes in some way his very approach to political thinking at a later stage. So this is partly why, telling the story of a hinge is that there is something that he carries with him across that period, from the middle to late 1950s, into the kind of work that becomes cultural studies at the University of Birmingham, which has a very deeply rooted literary critical base. And he never gives that up. And I think it's also the case that that the literary imagination shapes also his spoken voice, his way of articulating, his very vivid way of describing what he describes. Whether or to what extent fiction as a genre will inform my idea of biography, that's where I am also at loggerheads with some of my fellows.
Shall we leave it at that?
It's up to you. There's one more question.
I'm sorry.
Hello. I was wondering whether Stuart Hall ever was aware that his upbringing was essentially mimicry, that his family internalized mimicry, and if so, do you believe that this contributed to his long-standing critical gaze in everything that he did?
His long-standing
critical gaze.
critical gaze.
Yeah.
Stuart was very aware of the contradictions within his family. The idea of mimicry is a late 1980s set of preoccupations, although it's there already in Naipaul, the Mimic Men, etc., etc., etc. So it's a term that would have been very available for a way of describing a particular kind of social, individual, familial circumstances. And Stuart was very acutely aware of those contradictions. One of the reasons Stuart doesn't return when large numbers of Anglophone Caribbean folk are leaving Britain at the end of the 1950s, just at the point of independence, right, is that he does not want to re-enter that milieu in which there will be a certain kind of class expectation for him. He was primed to become a politician, right, of some sort. That was the kind of class background and then educational background that he had. Whether this formation is important for understanding the kind of intellectual that he was, is in fact one of one of the axes of the biography, because part of what has motivated my own thinking here is that the story of Stuart Hall is very often told from the moment he gets off the boat in Britain. And it is as though the early formation, he leaves Britain when he's 19 or thereabouts, right? So it's fairly late. He's not simply an adolescent anymore, he's a young adult. So there's a lot of formation that has already taken place. And I also think of this crucially when Stuart says in a very, very late essay, which you might be aware of, that in the 1980s he makes the long journey of discovery and recovery of himself as black. It's both a journey of recovery as well as discovery of who he both has become and was already. And that paradox is in some sense very crucial for the kind of complex picture that I'm aiming to draw of Stuart Hall.
So it's chicken time.
Thank you.